All right, guys. Well, welcome back to the channel, Noob D Ariel's Noob DM channel. It's been a while since I dropped the video. Got pretty hectic and busy once again, but here we are. I'm glad you tuned in to our latest offering. My latest offering. I'm gonna conclude our ongoing video series. We've had a video series about the different editions and the different supplements available to each edition of Dungeons and Dragons. We started with the current fifth edition. Now we're up to finally the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which is a viewer correctly pointed out. I should be referring to these as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons or AD&D as opposed to the D&D brand, which denotes uh, any source material that came before D&D. I'm sorry, that came after D&D and came before the 2000 3.5 system, which is just they dropped the advanced after that for branding reasons. So today I wanted to start with the Fiend Folio. And the Fiend Folio is a TSR product that almost every old school player knows. And I almost hesitate to include it in a discussion about supplements because, in a way, to me, it's kind of like almost one of the core books, even though the Monster Manual and Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide are thought of as the core books. The Fiend Folio, anything that falls outside of that realm, it's sort of like a supplement or another core book. But there were at least three bestiaries in the first edition, if you count Monster Manual, the Monster Manual 2, which had some really iconic monsters like the Beholder. If I'm not mistaken, I think the Beholder's Monster Manual 2 for first edition, and the Fiend Folio. And the Fiend Folio is a tome of creatures of malevolent and benign, but it's basically like it was like the British version, the British United Kingdom British version of the Monster Manual in the sense that most of the entries came from submissions to magazine and gaming magazine of the era, and there was a lot of controversy, publication controversy, and the history with the Fiend Folio and TSR. And TSR is actually the Fiend Folio was actually produced by submissions to GameWorks, if I'm not mistaken. So and edited by Don Turnbull at the time. Came out like 1981, I believe. I picked up a copy of it. I love the fact that it doesn't look anything like the other core books. I mean, it doesn't have the familiar orange spine. Like if you see the spine of the books have the orange spine for first edition, it doesn't have that. It's always its own thing. The Deities and Demigods is the other tome also that it kind of makes its own thing. But when I look at it, when I think back about on the Fiend Folio, I'm so glad. I mean, it just brings me back. It's one of my favorite supplements or one of my favorite core books or whatever you want to call it from first edition because the monsters are so unique in the sense that there's really nothing like it that had been collected in previous editions. And there really hasn't been anything like it since. Some of the more some of the more significant or iconic monsters like the Kokra, which are still the bird. It's like a birdman. The Ara Kokra. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And the Ara Kokra, they still exist. In fact, if I recently picked up a fifth edition setting for Critical Role, even though I'm not a big Critical Role fan, I do like the fact that Matt Mercer has done some world building, and he's Explorer's Guide to I think it's called Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, and Wildmount is sort of like a new setting that was invented for the show, or that Matt Mercer created for the show. But the Arakokra is they're present in that setting, and you guys, I'm pretty sure you can play them, they're included. It's either PCs or as a non-player characters, and I think it's fantastic that they've lasted so long. So you have those type of iconic monsters. You have your regular undead apparitions and demons and uh, things like that. But I look at things like dark stalkers and lols. I think this is the first mention that I see of the lols, the demon queen of spiders. I could be wrong, but she's definitely noted under the demon category as a lesser goddess. um, and it talks about how the demoness Loth is a very powerful and feared demon lord. She usually takes the form of a giant black widow spider when she's on the prime material plane. And I don't know if they make references to the Drow because later on, Loth is associated with the Drow, which are like dark, the very iconic, very famous dark elves that are, sort of controversial now when you look at revisionist history and you try to say, well, are why the Drow always evil elves, or should there be evil races? There was a big controversy about that, but last year, but be that as it may, this was Lowell's first entry that I recall into the Dungeons and Dragons realm, and the way she's depicted is somewhat problematic. Maybe I'll do a separate video on this because I was looking at some academic writings, the analog game studies, which is where my background or this background that I found for the Finfolio comes from, has a very interesting article by Sarah Stang about the Fiendfolio's female, like the Kelpies, vampires, and demon queens. And the whole premise of the article is about how female monsters are depicted. Usually are dangerous in a sort of what, if you look at it in a sort of sexist, misogynistic filter, then yes, you're going to find some tropes that are not exactly flattering to the females. For example, she talks about that in the Finfolio. They portray the kelpies, and the kelpies are sort of like from mythology, sort of derivative from like a mythological figure, and like many of the monsters in the Finfolio, according to the author of this article, the kelpie is derivative with aspects drawn from both Celtic mythology and the siren of Greek mythology. They're traditionally half bird women, but over time they were reimagined as half fish women with fishtails in place of lower eggs. And the problem with that is, according to the author, is that um, the idea emphasized in the description of the Kelpie as a creature that was created by the sea gods as punishment for men, which draws on ancient patriarchal mythology. For example, the first woman in Greek mythology, Pandora, was created explicitly by a male god to vex mankind and unleash miseries of the world on the world. And she goes on to talk about the Penangalan. The Penangalan is a female vampire, kind of like a disembodied floating head. And although it was designed for the Fiendfolio, it's the author mentions that it's a culturally appropriated monster, meaning that it's not a complete fabrication, but rather derivative of mythology and some mythological precedents. Primarily, uh, the creature is a mythical Southeast Asian creature, one of several Malay ghost myths. She's a female vampire type undead of fearsome power and nauseating appearance, and a vile creature that appears during the day as an attractive human female. So she takes some exceptions with um, this this vampire type female monster because of the way it is portrayed. But like I said, maybe I'll touch upon the cultural appropriation and some of the inappropriate use of sexist or more patriarchal and misogyny. That's a hard word for me to say, but you understand. But it's when we were playing the game, I remember fondly picking this up back. I was like a young man in my early teens, and I didn't really think about those concepts, to be honest. I looked at both male and female monsters just as monsters. It's like they have some traits to them that are not that are rooted in a fantasy world. Maybe they are reminiscent of mythology, but never really thought about um, what their construct or what if there's like an underlying theme. You know what I mean? It's like there was that was never even entered my mind, although maybe I wasn't sensitive to those type of issues before. But I will always look at um, this specific volume with a lot of fondness for what it represented and what it still sort of brings to the table today with a unique collection of creatures for first edition Dungeons and Dragons. All right, guys. So we're moving on to another one of my favorite supplements for first edition. The Manual of the Planes. You can see the cover here in the background by Jeff Grubb. Um, and this is a very, it depicts, right off the bat, a very strong visual, um, with the cover art by Jeff Easley. And it's got some terrific interior illustrations by Stephen Fabian and Jeff Easley. And I looked for a long time. I gotta confess, I recently picked up a copy of this manual, and I didn't really own this when I was playing my first edition games back in the day. I knew of it, and I actually saw a couple of people use the book as a guide in some later games in college, and which I really didn't participate in. But be that as it may, excuse me, I always um I always wanted to own a copy of this, and this year I decided to go ahead and hunt it down. And it didn't come cheap, and it wasn't easy to find a really good copy. So I was happy that I was able to do that finally. Um, you know, the thing about the planes is that always fascinated me ever since I saw a diagram of the various planes of existence. I think back in the Dungeon Master's guide for first. It might actually I take it back. I think it was in the back of the player's handbook for first edition, if I'm not mistaken. Is when first laid eyes on. It's like a one page or a two-page fold out. It talks about the different planes of existence, and back then it doesn't um, it didn't occur to me that later on there was going to be a whole um, core book or a series of books and supplements talking about the planes, um, the ethereal plane, the inner plane, the plane of elemental air, and the plane of elemental fires, all the elemental planes, um, the positive quasi planes. There's all kinds of planes, and all my favorite were the outer planes, because what I think attracted me and attracts a lot of people to the planes is that our reality, which takes place in the prime material plane in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons, in the universe of Dungeons and Dragons, it sort of mirrors sort of man's need for exploration. We all have a tendency to want to explore beyond beyond our comprehension or beyond our dimensions, and there are definite sci-fi and fantasy tropes about uh, different dimensions and different realms of existence and different planes of existence, and that was always a fascinating concept to me and to a lot of other people because this is a very popular um, a very popular trope, a very popular um, idea or a set of ideas. So, and what I like specifically, I like the astral plane. I like the elemental planes. This book goes ahead and covers um, not only overview of like the different planes of existence that you can put your games in as a dungeon master, but it also talks about the different types of spells and how spells are kind of affected by the different planes. Because there's one method, or there's one way of thinking about casting spells if you're a wizard or a specific spellcaster, and it makes sense that it would be logical that the spells would behave differently in a different plane of existence versus the way they behave normally in the prime material plane. So it talks about magic. This book really goes in depth into the different classes and how those kind of things like spells are affected by being in the inner or outer planes, or whatever plane you happen to find yourself in. So like the whole first part of the book it's just dedicated to the different planes, the energy of the different planes, the quasi elemental planes. How to travel in and out of the planes, which is talked about a little bit in that one brief description I mentioned in the first edition player's handbook. It talks about it gives a lot of information on the astral planes, um, and how to reach and how to deal with encounters in the astral planes. Even movement in the astral plane is different than it is in the prime material plane. So it talks about how that movement is actually works. It talks about the magic, again, magic in the astral plane. Conjurations and abjurations and alterations and how all that works. And it even gives you advice for the player characters, like what your clerics and your druids and your paladins and the different classes, how they'll be affected by being in a different plane of existence. And then it goes into the outer planes. I thought it was really interesting because the outer planes haven't really changed a whole lot. I mean, this concept is carried into third edition, fourth edition, even fifth edition source books or supplements. But the outer planes in the original first edition included Mercuria, Dothion, uh, places like Asgard, which people Marvel fans are familiar with Thor and they're familiar with the Asgardian mythological uh, gods. And then you had Pazunia, you had places like Pluton, Malgolgi, I think I'm saying that correctly, Malgolgi, which is like you're playing with, where you find your demons or different types of demons, and Ocanthus. So it talks about movement and survival in the plains, and it gives you some tables to roll so that you can have different effects in the plains. Nirvana, and then it goes into Arcadia. It goes into the more popular planes: Arcadia, the Seven Heavens, the Twin Paradises, Elysium. An interesting note is that on page 91 of the plane, this manual of the planes, you'll find the Happy Hunting Grounds and the features of the Happy Hunting Grounds. You will not find the Happy Hunting Grounds I saw in fourth edition or fifth edition um, play manuals, because I guess there's sensitivity towards Native Americans, and Native Americans in our world or in our reality are it was like an idea about the happy hunting right, but somehow it became pejorative, like something you condemn. Yeah, pejorative term, and it was not. Um, it's not something that is sort of kind of faced away because of time where it's not really flattering to think that Native Americans um, are going to the happy hunting grounds. So they kind of face that away from culture, and I understand that. Then there's Olympus, and you know, talked about uh, that the mythological influence and Limbo, the features of Limbo, Pandemonium. So you get the idea. Is the Abyss? You get the idea. This book is very detailed. Um, uh, Features of Hades, um, the Nine Hells, and even though the Nine Hells are and the different type of devils are described in Monster Manual 2 for first edition, and then when second edition came out, they were not there. I mean, they got rid of the devils because of the satanic scare, as we talked about in this channel before, but they didn't get rid of the demons altogether. What they did is they just rebranded them, so they were a completely different creature, but they were still demons and devils. They just um, were not referred to as demons and devils. And I don't know if the devils went away completely. I can't remember, but Asmodeus, I think that's the way you say this, Asmodeus, who is the ruler of the ninth level of hell, he came up with a lot of early adventures that I had with my players in first edition because they love traveling to the other planes. You get stuck in hell, and there's a lot of role playing possibility. You got some paladins you can imagine they can fight the demons, fight devils, and all that jazz. There's also they call the plane of concordant opposition. It's very interesting, um, that it's still here, you know. So the book ends with an appendix on the prime material planes, some of the effects, some of the typical effects. Excuse me, typical effects in the planes and survival. How do you decide the characters survive? There's a second appendix which talks about the creatures in the inner planes, with not a lot of detail, just sort of give you an idea of what their abilities are. I guess you can pick up the other monster manuals and the monster manuals and get more in-depth information on that. And then there's also a summary of the creatures from the outer planes and their abilities and their powers and what they do. Um, and that's pretty much the whole book. From Arcadia to Pandemonium, from the plane of elemental fire to the astral plane, vast new worlds of adventure are now open to players. That was the copy text in the back of the book, and it's true. It's completely true. It's like one of my favorite um, first edition additions to my first edition collection, and I'm really happy to have it because a lot of players are even today having. I was in a fifth edition campaign where there was a war. The DM had a war between the planes, and it was players traveling into there was like a whole magic book that would let somebody peer into the astral plane, I think, or the ethereal plane, one of the planes, and it was interesting. And I was like, we discovered the planes back in first edition, and it's pretty cool that they're still around. So there you have it. Two of my favorite. I don't really have a lot of supplements beyond the core books for first edition. I have some modules, but everybody's kind of familiar with some of the early modules. And if they're not, maybe I'll do a video about them in a later time and go a little bit more in depth. But these are my first edition supplements that I really hold dear to my heart, and I hope you enjoyed taking the ride and taking a look uh, at them. And so this concludes our examination of the my favorite supplements for all of the editions of Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not sure what the topic will be next, but stay tuned for that. And I will put some links in the description to some of the articles that I mentioned in this video, so that you can take a look at and formulate your own idea about the influences of the Fiend Folio and this type of early supplements on our favorite role playing game. All right. Well, talk to you guys later and take care. Have a great day. Thanks for tuning in. Oh, and as always, if you like this content, don't remember, don't forget to like and or subscribe, so keep the channel going. Talk to you guys. All right, guys. As you can see, the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Manual of the Planes, as I talked about. I just wanted to kind of give you guys a little view of what's in the book, and so happy to have this as part of my collection, as I mentioned. So you see some of this great artwork, the demi-planes of the ethereal, and it describes like the different planes, earth, elemental planes, the inner planes rather, and it just goes into the planes of elemental water, the different type of elemental planes, and it has a lot of diagrams, which I find it pretty fascinating because it compares, gives you a graphical comparison of how to, what the planes are all about, how to travel there, that type of thing. It's a lot of text, a lot of reading in this book, but if you like this type of stuff, the astral plane, then you will enjoy reading it, I think, for the most part. So it's not as here is a whole table of the outer planes and what they are. I was talking about the different outer planes. So you have your the concordant opposition in the middle, and then the other planes circling around it. So a lot of heavy text and a lot of copy in this supplement. So if you don't like reading, you probably won't enjoy it as much. Stupid me, I dropped the phone, so I apologize. This is the last bit. I just wanted to share, you know, what the book entails or what it has to offer, and why it's one of my favorite supplements because it's uh, it's really great in terms of the information that you find about the planes. Not so much not so much, as I said, as a visual masterpiece. Despite this fantastic cover, it doesn't have a whole lot of as much rich artwork in every other page as you find in other supplements. But for what it is, it's definitely more of a you know source book for to get more in depth into the planes. So there you go. There you go. That's the Manual of the Planes by Jeff Grubb, the first edition version.